In this video series, we will be focusing on React and the front end of any web application that we might be building using full stack technologies. In this instance, we are going to be using React. Now, what is React would be the question that we need to ask ourselves to begin with. And here you can see I've done a Google search for React. And the first page that has come up has been React.js.org, which is the primary website for React. And here's some of the information pulled from either that website or else Wikipedia. And if we look at this little definition right here, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And in all reality, that one sentence pretty much says it all. React is definitely a framework or library, whichever you want to use. They both mean pretty much the same thing, that is built on top of JavaScript. In other words, JavaScript is the language that was used to create the framework. It is programmed in JavaScript, and it executes within the browser. And React is specifically designed for the creation of user interfaces. That is the front end that our users interact with. And with that definition, we understand that really React, because it's written in JavaScript and executes as the front end for our applications, and it runs in the browser, it really does just focus on this interaction that the user has with our application. And it is through React that we have the ability to design and build and implement the user interfaces in order to provide the users with the experience and the functionality that we feel they need in order to correctly interact with our application. Now, if we think about any user interface, like React's interface right here, the majority of our interfaces, if we pull up the Chrome developer tools and we look at it, in the browser, interfaces are designed using HTML. And as we can see, the entire React website right here is done in HTML. And HTML is that core technology that we use in browsers. And so React utilizes JavaScript as the programming language in order to create the interaction within the user or for the user within the application. And React is also responsible for helping us as developers generate and create HTML for our websites inside of our user interfaces that provide specific functionality for our users. And the really cool thing is that in traditional HTML, we would actually write, if we pull this back up, I probably shouldn't have closed it. If we pull it back up, we can see that all of this HTML in traditional web applications, we would write all of this HTML in templates or as HTML pages themselves. If we're talking about a static application or a static website, we would write all of this HTML for each and every page by itself, and it would be statically sent to the user from the web server. Now that's a static website. We moved from static websites where every page was all of this HTML in a HTML document that would then be served up by the web server. We moved from that to more dynamic monolithic web applications where we tried to take common portions of the web page, such as here, let's go ahead and pull open our Screen Ink so that we can just draw right on our page. We would take common attributes in a page or common components within a page, and I'm going to make sure we have no fill on this. And then let's choose a square shape, and then let's use bright yellow. We would take common components within the web page, like this navigation, or this hero, as we like to call them, or this big area that really stands out and points something out. And we would take these and we would create partials or partial portions of the page. And then those partials would be injected into a primary layout. Now, the primary layout would probably have, as part of it, it would have this navigation, and it would probably have the footer down at the bottom of the page, as well as the definitions for the way this web application should look and feel, or this website should look and feel. And then for each individual page that we have, such as the docs, the tutorial, the blog, and the community, each of those would have partials for their content. And partials meaning that the portions of the page that are specific to that particular page within the web application would potentially have dynamic content pulled from a database and then injected into the HTML in partials. And so on the home page, this page specifically, you would probably have this show up as a partial. And then these would most likely be pulled from a database and then compiled into HTML and then injected into the page as partials as well. Now, in monolithic web applications, this was all done on the server. In other words, the server took care of all that heavy lifting, and it would do all of the compilation of the JavaScript, and it would create all of the HTML, and it would put all of that JavaScript and all of the HTML that was needed in order to create this user interface, and it would get it all set up, and then it would push all of it out to the user at one time. And then if a user were to go and click on this docs link right here in this navigation, a request would be sent back to the server for the server to build that documents page with all of its related content. And that includes anything that would be in that page. So let's go ahead and go back to our mouse here. Let's click on our documents page. And you can see that the layout of our documents page is a little bit different. Now we have some common elements, just like the navigation that was on the home page, but the page layout itself has actually changed. So for this particular page, the server would have compiled the HTML that makes up this main part of the page and would have compiled the HTML that would have made this part of the page. And then it would have combined it all, stuck it into the main layout that has the navigation in it as well as the common look and feel for the entire website, compile all that HTML together, attach all JavaScript that's required to it, and then it would send that all back to the browser or to the client, and the client would download all the HTML, parse it, and then it would pull all of the embedded JavaScript references and then call all of those documents from the web server, and we would have a new page. Now with that, because the server was doing all of the work, because back in those days, users didn't have very fast internet connections. And with very slow internet connections, it was really hard to pass a ton of data across the internet, but also people had less complex and less sophisticated computers with less powerful graphics card, less powerful processors, and less memory. And therefore, the majority of all of this work was done on the server because companies could afford to build big, strong servers that could handle building all of this and sending it to the clients across the network. And then, of course, with regular HTML and HTTP, we had the ability to begin to cache or store parts of these pages that are not being redrawn or recompiled on the server. And so with some caching strategies, we would be able to begin to optimize what was sent to and from the client. Well, that was a great way to do things when internet connections were slow and people had really low-powered computers. Now, as the internet became faster and faster, more commonplace, and people had faster broadband connections, as well as having all of the modern PCs and Macs, as well as Linux, becoming those computer systems receiving higher powered CPUs and graphics cards, along with the high-powered internet or the broadband internet, we had more computing resources at our fingertips as software developers or as web developers. So what we began to do was, instead of having the server handle all of this on the server side, we began to create JavaScript inside of our web applications. Now, they were still monolithic. They still created all of the HTML and pushed it to the user. But when we got each of these pages up on the user's system, instead of making a request back for the entire page to be generated and rendered by the web server, what we did instead is we would send XML HTTP requests, which are asynchronous requests, back to our servers to get just plain old XML data instead of full-blown HTML pages, and we began to just update certain parts of the page. So let's say that we're on the blogs page right here, and a new post came through, and we have JavaScript checking behind the scenes to see if a new post has come in. Well, this part of the page would then be updated dynamically through an HTTP XML request, which was an asynchronous request that was done by the browser through JavaScript across the internet to the server to find out if any information had changed on this page. And if the information had changed, then XML would be sent back across the internet, and then we would update just this part of the page. Now that's where we began to sort of reduce the amount of load on our web servers and started to have the client's computer begin to do a little bit of that work for us. In other words, now the client, although all of the HTML and CSS and JavaScript was all first sent to the client, we began to update information in the page dynamically with background calls using XML HTTP requests. Now, as that became more and more popular, and we started to create more and more complex applications where we began to have maybe this update dynamically in the background, and then maybe some more content down here on the page would update. Maybe this stuff over here would update dynamically, or we would do dynamic searches where when the user typed stuff into the search, it would make XML HTTP requests in the background to the web server, and we would get just XML data back, and we would update maybe this page right here or the contents of this page with whatever they searched for. So if they were searching for blog posts on React Router, then we would update with the latest posts that had something about React Router in here without making a full page request back to the server and having the server build the page. We would get that data back, and we would build that page using JavaScript on the client's system or in their browser. Now, as we started developing more and more complex web applications on the front end using just good old-fashioned JavaScript or using a library called jQuery, which was extremely popular for a very long time and is actually still used today, when we did that, we began to find that these applications became extremely complex, and companies began to create their own custom frameworks that ran in the browser that would begin to handle more and more of that page rendering, page generation, and page creation logic, as well as the remote or asynchronous calls to get information from the web server. They began to create frameworks that did that for them. Now, some really cool frameworks that are out there. Number one is React, which was created by Facebook in order to help create a really responsive and interactive user experience in the Facebook application. Also, Google created what's called Angular, and Angular does a very similar thing and is simply the same type of framework. It's just written differently and does a few different things that makes one of them better in different situations. And you just have to pick and choose which one works best for the application you're creating. Well, we're going to focus on React. Now, as they built these frameworks that made this dynamic HTML generation so easy, they began to change from monolithic web applications where the actual HTML for this page and the JavaScript and everything was created on the server, compiled through partials and layouts, and then pushed out to the user's browser. Instead, they began to create a single HTML page, which was a completely generic framework or scaffold of the HTML that the application would use. That HTML page would then be sent out to the browser along with a list of all of the JavaScript files that it needed in order to function. And we began using what are called components. And components followed the same kind of process that we just went through when we were talking about partials, or on the web server when pages would be put together in partials and then pushed out as full HTML. Now we look at things in the form of components, which means in this page we look at things that have common functionality and we compile them into what we call components. In other words, we take this work that this part of the page does and we make it its own thing. And we'll get into more details of that. I'm using pretty generic descriptors when I say its own thing. But when we get into React components, you'll better understand what I'm talking about. In other words, when we looked at this over here, when we were talking about partials, and we asked the server to generate this, well, instead of doing that, what we decided to do was let's take the HTML that this is made out of, as well as any functionality that it may have, such as updating or searching or anything like that, and let's put it into its own little bit of HTML and its own JavaScript, and let's make it its own component and make it responsible for itself. Instead of the entire page being responsible for this, let's make it responsible for itself and let's include it in any page that we need. Same thing goes with this. If we have these blog posts, we would then turn a blog post into a component, and then a component would be responsible for a individual blog post. And it would be responsible for rendering the title right here. And it would be responsible for showing the author and the date, and it would be responsible for showing the content. In other words, it would be in control of all of the HTML that is used to render this, as well as any interactivity that that component would provide to the user, such as on-click or clicking or sorting or updating information. Now this will become more clear as we get more into components, as we start to break down a user interface and begin to build a little application that actually follows this. Now, as we went to just pushing out a single HTML page and then having components take care of each page and then the parts of the page, we went from these monolithic multi-page web applications to a single page application where the web server spit out only one HTML document to the browser. And then from that point on, the framework, such as React or Angular, would then take over simulating multiple pages by using components. And then inside of each of those pages, those components would pull in any components that they needed in order to provide data, information, or functionality that a user might need on that page. Now, this might not make a ton of sense right now, but as we begin to dive into React and how React works, especially as we start to explain components, it would be good if you come back and rewatch this video and see how your increased knowledge of components and how they work begin to help you understand what I'm explaining in this video better. So we're going to go ahead and move on. Make sure you come back and rewatch this as you learn more about React, and make sure that you understand what I've said during this video.